their DNA, they have the DNA of a heavenly creature. Have you ever heard of the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh?
From documents like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, there are obvious parallels between some of these other ancient stories and the narratives we find in the biblical accounts.
The forgotten king of Uruk, when myth became flesh, in the blistering heart of southern Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates once twisted like a serpent through the desert, stood Uruk, the first great city of humankind. Today it is nothing but a field of shattered bricks and wind-worn foundations. But 5,000 years ago, Uruk was a miracle of stone and order, its temples gleaming in the sun, its walls stretching as far as the eye could see. The ancients called it the city where kingship descended from heaven, and presiding over it was a man whose name has haunted both historians and dreamers, Gilgamesh, the king who is said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. For centuries, scholars treated him as myth, a poetic invention, no more real than Hercules or Achilles. Yet the deeper archaeologists dug, the less certain that judgment became. Beneath the sands of modern-day Iraq, among the ruins of the world's first civilization, the Sumerians, they began finding fragments, inscriptions, lists, and relics that spoke of a real king of Uruk who reigned around 2600 BCE. His name appeared not in mythic epics, but in royal genealogies and administrative records. One cuneiform tablet from the ancient city of Nippur even listed his reign alongside known historical rulers. The myth, it seemed, had a heartbeat. But if Gilgamesh truly lived, he was no ordinary king. The oldest stories describe him as colossal in stature, unstoppable in war, and wise beyond measure. Artists carved him towering over his soldiers, clutching lions as if they were kittens. He was depicted wearing a horned headdress, the symbol of divinity in Sumerian art, and his body radiated power. The text said he knew the ways of all things, that he saw the deep, and wrote the story of the flood before the flood was known, who worshipped gods walking among men. Gilgamesh was an anomaly. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries after his supposed reign, is the oldest surviving piece of literature in human history. It tells of a ruler who, unsatisfied with mortal life, sought to defy death itself. The gods create a wild man, Enkidu, to humble him, but instead, the two become brothers. Together they slay the monster Humbaba and the bull of heaven, angering the divine order. When Enkidu dies as punishment, Gilgamesh descends into despair, embarking on a journey to find the secret of immortality. He crosses deserts and seas, meets Utnapishtim, the survivor of a primordial flood, and learns the cruel truth: eternal life belongs only to the gods. To scholars, the story was an allegory about man's mortality. To others, it was something else, a memory of something real. In the 19th century, when European explorers began rediscovering the ruins of Mesopotamia, they found cuneiform tablets buried by the thousands. The words of the ancient world came back to life, written in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. And among them were copies of the epic itself. The flood described by Utnapishtim mirrored the story of Noah, the gods who descended to earth and taught mankind the arts of civilization, echoed the watchers of the Book of Enoch, the Anunnaki of Sumerian religion. Slowly, a pattern emerged, a strange continuity between the oldest myths and the earliest recorded beliefs. Could these stories have been describing events that really happened, using the language of divinity to explain encounters with beings who were not quite human? The Sumerians believed their kingship descended from heaven. They spoke of rulers born of divine unions, their bloodlines glowing with celestial heritage. In temple hymns, they recorded how the gods shaped mankind from clay, but infused a chosen few with something greater. Gilgamesh, they wrote, was the perfect one, the radiant offspring of Ninsun, the wild cow goddess. It was always assumed to be myth, until the 21st century, when a discovery in the ruins of Uruk began to blur that line forever. In 2003, a German archaeological team led by Dr. Joe R.G. Fassbinder conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys around the ancient riverbeds near Warka, the modern site of Uruk. Their scans revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the dry Euphrates plain lay the remnants of geometric structures, walls, foundations, and what appeared to be a rectangular chamber aligned directly under the ancient course of the river. The data matched descriptions from the Epic of Gilgamesh itself. The text claimed that when the great king died, his people diverted the Euphrates, carved out a tomb beneath the river, and then let the waters flow again to seal him forever in a chamber where no man may reach. At first, the German team treated the alignment as coincidence, but as they continued scanning, they detected traces of stone and what looked like collapsed ceilings. The arrangement was too symmetrical, too deliberate. One member of the expedition privately called it a city beneath the river. The idea was dismissed as impossible. Diverting a river was an engineering feat beyond Bronze Age capability, or so historians thought. But the Sumerians were not ordinary builders. They were masters of canals, irrigation, and hydraulic design. They tamed rivers to feed their crops and built levees that lasted for centuries. The idea that they might have redirected the Euphrates, even temporarily, was not beyond belief. Soon after the scans were completed, something changed. The project halted abruptly. The site was declared closed. Officially, the reason was regional instability. Unofficially, there were whispers, rumors of organic traces found in deep sediment, possibly remnants of resin and bone, preserved by the silt and mineral deposits. If true, that would have been one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in human history, the body of the world's first legendary king. But no official report was ever published. The images, scans, and notes vanished into government archives. Some claimed the findings were suppressed to prevent political or religious upheaval. Others said nothing was ever found at all. Yet the story refused to die. For years afterward, satellite imagery of the area revealed faint depressions in the soil, patterns consistent with buried ruins. Independent researchers detected electromagnetic anomalies beneath the old river channel, suggesting the presence of dense, non-natural materials, possibly stonework or metal. And scattered around the region, new fragments of tablets began to appear. One spoke cryptically of the sleeping one beneath the river, a phrase scholars couldn't explain. Another mentioned a tomb where the gods descend to guard the flesh of the king. Was this poetic symbolism, or a record of something real? If the tomb existed, it could answer the greatest question in ancient history: who was Gilgamesh really? Was he merely a human king whose life had been mythologized, or a being whose lineage truly diverged from our own? The discovery reignited one of archaeology's oldest arguments: the blurred frontier between myth and history. The Sumerians had always claimed that their rulers were not fully human. Could this be more than metaphor? Could their stories of divine blood have referred to an actual biological difference, something encoded in the very DNA of their kings? The world didn't have to wait long for an answer, because by the 2020s, science had developed a new language to probe the past: ancient DNA sequencing. If a body or even residual genetic traces could be recovered from Uruk's riverbed, the genome could be analyzed, compared, and dated. For the first time in history, the claim that Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine could be tested, not through theology, but through genetics. Quietly, without fanfare, small samples from Uruk's lower layers, classified as alite burials, were sent to laboratories in Europe for analysis, and what those labs found defied every law of anthropology. The initial mitochondrial data looked normal, typical of ancient Mesopotamian populations, but the nuclear DNA, the code that defines individuality, was wrong. Segments of it did not match any known lineage. Some resembled archaic hominins like Neanderthals, others were unlike anything in the global genome databases. The sequences were coherent, structured, not random noise or contamination, but belonging to no species ever recorded. The researchers described them as ghost markers, a term used for genetic fragments inherited from an unknown, extinct ancestor. But what made the discovery terrifying was the scale. The proportion of this ghost DNA was far higher than anything ever seen in known human samples. Whoever these remains belonged to, they were not entirely Homo sapiens. It was a genetic outlier, one so extreme that one scientist reportedly said, "If this profile is real, we are looking at a different kind of being." Suddenly, the ancient words of the Sumerians no longer sounded like metaphor. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Could that be a literal description of genetic hybridity? The line between history and myth had cracked open. And if the data was authentic, the implications were staggering. That civilization's first king might have been the last descendant of an unknown species. A hybrid that once walked among men, ruling, building, teaching, and then vanishing back into the dust of legend. And if Gilgamesh was real, what else in those ancient texts might be real too? The flood, the gods who descended from the heavens, the bloodlines that shaped the world. For thousands of years, we thought we had inherited the earth from beasts. But perhaps long before history began, we inherited it from gods. The river Tome mystery beneath the waters of Uruk, the epic of Gilgamesh ends where myth and mortality meet. With the death of the king who sought to defy death itself. It tells of how his people mourned for 7 days and nights, how they wept, as if he were a god fallen from the heavens, and how, in their devotion, they did something no civilization before or after would dare attempt. They diverted an entire river. They carved his resting place beneath the living water. They sealed him there forever, not in a tomb of stone, but in the earth's own bloodstream. For centuries, historians read that as poetry. The ancient Sumerians were master storytellers after all. To bury a god beneath a river, what more powerful metaphor could there be for life, death, and rebirth? But in the early 2000s, technology began to test the limits of poetry, and the results were nothing short of unsettling. In 2003, a team of German archaeologists led by Dr. Gerard G. Fassbinder arrived at modern-day Warqa, Iraq, the site of ancient Uruk. Using ground-penetrating radar and magnetic imaging, they began scanning the floodplains surrounding the old Euphrates bed. At first, they expected to find the remains of canals and irrigation systems, remnants of the Sumerians' advanced water management. Instead, they found something impossible. Under the dry riverbed, their equipment detected geometric anomalies, perfectly rectangular formations aligned with unnatural precision. Among them was one structure larger and denser than the rest, surrounded by collapsed embankments that hinted at deliberate construction. It was buried beneath several meters of silt, exactly where the Euphrates once flowed 5,000 years ago. When the data was compared against topographical records of ancient Uruk, one realization became unavoidable. The structure's position matched the epic's description line for line. The text claimed that the people of Uruk diverted the river to carve a tomb for their king, then released the waters again to seal him forever beneath the current. For the first time, archaeology and myth were speaking the same language. At first, Fassbinder's team was cautious. Natural sedimentation could sometimes create symmetrical shapes. But as they continued to scan deeper, the anomalies became more complex. What appeared to be corridors, chamber outlines, and walls of different material density began to take shape on the radar. The geometry was unmistakable. This wasn't geology, it was architecture. And that's when the first rumors began. Local workers whispered that after several weeks of digging, the team had uncovered traces of something they couldn't explain. Resin, fibrous material, and organic residue deep within one of the sealed layers. It wasn't enough to identify, but it was enough to suggest that something, or someone, had once been entombed there. The excavation reportedly halted soon after. Officially, The reason was security concerns. Iraq was entering a period of instability and archaeological missions were suspended. But unofficially, those close to the dig claimed a very different story, that excavation had uncovered human remains preserved in a layer of hardened silt, and that local authorities ordered the site sealed. No photographs were released. No samples were catalogued. The data from the radar scans was quietly archived and never published. The world might have forgotten the discovery altogether if not for the persistence of satellite technology. Over the next decade, high-resolution imagery revealed subtle discolorations and depressions along the old Euphrates Channel near Warka, consistent with subterranean structures. Independent researchers analyzing electromagnetic readings reported mineral anomalies indicative of dense stone or metal beneath the surface, possible remnants of a sealed chamber. Then came the most disturbing detail. Several ancient inscriptions recovered from nearby ruins mentioned a phrase that had never been fully translated before: the sleeping one beneath the river. Was this a poetic title or a literal description? The more the pieces came together, the harder it became to ignore. The location fit. The engineering matched. The Sumerians had the hydraulic knowledge to manipulate rivers, and if they truly revered Gilgamesh as two-thirds divine, burying him beneath the Euphrates, the very artery of their civilization, would have been the ultimate act of worship. But what exactly was sealed there? A body, a sarcophagus, or something far stranger? Something the ancients themselves had feared enough to hide from the world forever. By the early 2020s, the story of Gilgamesh's tomb resurfaced in whispers. This time, it wasn't driven by archaeologists, but by geneticists. Advances in ancient DNA extraction had reached unprecedented precision. Scientists were sequencing genomes from Ice Age skeletons, from Egyptian mummies, even from dirt samples in caves that once held extinct species. If any biological trace of Gilgamesh still existed, no matter how degraded, it could, in theory, be analyzed. That was when an unmarked research initiative known only as Project Uruk began quietly circulating through academic channels. Its stated goal was environmental sampling of the Warka floodplain. But insiders later revealed the truth. The project was gathering coarse sediment samples from the same river channel scanned by the German team 2 decades earlier. On paper, it was an environmental study. In reality, it was a DNA recovery operation. Sediment from riverbeds can preserve microscopic traces of genetic material for millennia. It was a technique known as eDNA, environmental DNA, used to detect traces of extinct animals, ancient crops, and even human activity. The samples from Warka were shipped to a private genomics facility in Europe under strict confidentiality. Weeks later, the lab began detecting faint signals of human mitochondrial DNA, the kind passed down maternally. That alone wasn't unusual. Ancient Mesopotamia had been densely populated for millennia. But when they analyzed the nuclear DNA, the complete genetic code, the anomalies began. Segments of the genome didn't match anything known from that region or period. They weren't Mesopotamian, African, or Eurasian. They weren't Neanderthal or Denisovan. They were something else, a coherent sequence that didn't belong anywhere on the human family tree. At first, contamination seemed the obvious explanation: soil bacteria, cross-lab interference. But repeated sequencing produced the same results. The DNA was ancient, genuine, and entirely out of place. The researchers had stumbled upon what one geneticist called ghost ancestry, genetic fragments from an unidentified species that had interbred with early humans, yet was completely missing from the fossil record. But what made the discovery shocking was how much of this ghost DNA was present. In known ancient genomes, archaic DNA rarely exceeds 2 to 4%. But the sample from Warka, the one believed to be from the river tombs surrounding sediment, contained a proportion exceeding 20%. Whoever the genetic material belonged to, they were not entirely human. The researchers began referencing their findings with known ancient samples. The closest parallels weren't from Mesopotamia at all, but from Central Asia, from mysterious populations that predated the earliest known civilizations. These people vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clear descendants. Could one of their lineages have survived, hidden, interwoven with humanity's earliest kings? That was the question that haunted the Project Uruk team. If the Sumerians had ever encountered such a being, a hybrid of human and something older, it would explain everything: the myths of divine kingship, the obsession with godly lineage, the notion of bloodlines chosen by the heavens. It would even explain why Gilgamesh's mother, Ninsun, was called the goddess of the wild cow, a being of both heaven and earth. The findings should have been a scientific triumph. Instead, they became a silent crisis. According to leaked correspondence, debates erupted among the researchers. Some wanted to publish immediately. Others warned that the implications were too volatile. One analyst allegedly wrote, "If we release this, every religion on Earth will have to rewrite its creation story." And then, just as quickly as it had surfaced, Project Uruk disappeared. Its digital records were erased. The lab's online repository went dark. Access to the excavation zone was restricted by new preservation laws. The government cited cultural protection, but insiders whispered a different phrase: containment. It's impossible to prove what was really found beneath the river of Uruk. No images exist. No reports were ever peer-reviewed, but fragments of communication between scientists, leaked emails, conference notes, and second-hand testimonies suggest that whatever lay buried there was unlike anything else in human history. A body that wasn't fully human, DNA that didn't fit within evolution, and a burial engineered not to honor a man but to hide him. If the story is true, then the world's first city might also be the world's first quarantine, a civilization sealing away a secret they didn't want the future to uncover, a being who was both their ruler and their warning. And now, millennia later, science had brushed against that warning again. Because if the genetic material from Uruk really did belong to Gilgamesh, then the ancient Sumerians were not lying when they called him 2/3 divine. It was not poetry. It was classification. They had buried a god, and we, in our arrogance, had begun to dig him up. The genetic revelation, the DNA that shouldn't exist. In the sterile glow of a European genetics lab, 5,000 years of history were about to come undone. The samples labeled Uruk environmental cores sat in sealed containers, each no bigger than a thumb drive, each holding microscopic fragments of sediment from a forgotten tomb beneath an ancient river. The scientists handling them didn't know the full story. They weren't told these came from the alleged resting place of Gilgamesh, the first recorded king in human history. Officially, they were studying ancient Mesopotamian microbial DNA. Unofficially, they were tracing the bloodline of a god. For months, the research progressed quietly under a project name that appeared nowhere in public databases: Project Uruk. The samples were extracted, purified, and sequenced using the latest high-coverage genomic mapping systems. The first results seemed mundane: traces of human DNA mixed with environmental residue, what one would expect from river silt in a densely inhabited region. Then came the second round of testing. What the machines began to reveal was so out of place that at first the team thought it was a software failure. Segments of genetic code, small but distinct, appeared that did not match any known Mesopotamian, Eurasian, or African lineage. They weren't similar to Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA either. The two archaic relatives of modern humans already cataloged in genetic archives. They were something else. The sequences were coherent, structured, and consistent across samples. Not contamination, not bacterial noise, but a patterned, inherited code belonging to something that wasn't us, or at least not entirely. At first, the lead geneticist dismissed the findings as an anomaly caused by degradation. But as more data poured in, the pattern persisted across multiple sequences from different soil layers. The same anomalies reappeared. Identical gene fragments repeating like echoes through time. It was as if a second genome was whispering through the dirt. When the team compared these segments to global databases, they found faint similarities to archaic DNA from Central Asia, ancient lineages that predated known human migrations. But the overlap was incomplete. Roughly 20% of the genetic material matched no reference genome on Earth. The computer flagged it with a single label, unclassified ancestry. That term had appeared before in obscure academic papers. Geneticists call it ghost lineage DNA, evidence of an unidentified species that once interbred with early humans, leaving behind traces in our genome but disappearing without a fossil record. Yet this case was different. The level of divergence was far greater than anything found in modern humans. Whoever or whatever this DNA belonged to had not simply mixed with humans. It had shared a genome unlike any species ever cataloged. One researcher described it later as the genetic equivalent of finding a new planet in Earth's orbit. In the weeks that followed, the lab became a pressure cooker of silence and disbelief. Every verification test came back with the same result. The mitochondrial DNA, inherited from the maternal line, was fully human, matching regional Sumerian populations. But the nuclear DNA, which carries the blueprint of ancestry, was split. Half of it was recognizably human. The rest was something older, something the software couldn't classify. It was then that the project supervisors, now aware of the discovery's potential, quietly reached out to two additional geneticists, specialists in archaic admixture from institutions in France and the United States. Both were asked to analyze anonymized datasets. Neither was told the origin of the samples. When the results came back, both independent analysts wrote the same note in their reports. Genome contains significant proportion of unknown hominin markers, inconsistent with any known lineage. One of them added a single line beneath it, possible hybrid origin. It was the first time the word hybrid had appeared in official correspondence. That single word changed everything. The researchers began to cross-reference the ancient texts. The Sumerians had long described their kings as descendants of heaven. The oldest inscriptions called Gilgamesh, the perfect one, radiant offspring of the goddess Ninsun. Scholars had dismissed these as poetic flourishes, allegories of divine favor. But now, sitting before a glowing monitor displaying unclassifiable DNA, the words read more like science than mythology. Could the phrase, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, have been a literal description, an ancient attempt to articulate genetic difference? By early 2024, fragments of the Project Uruk data began to leak. Anonymous emails, screenshots of genome maps, and redacted correspondence appeared on private research forums. Most were quickly deleted, but not before spreading like wildfire through the underground academic community.